The scuffed toe of the sneaker was the first thing to break the plane. A Converse knockoff, gray canvas worn thin over the big toe, the rubber peeling away like a loose tooth. It weighed maybe 4 ounces. It was attached to a girl who weighed 93 pounds. And for a period of 0.7 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:17 p.m., it was the only thing standing between a 6-year-old boy and a 10-ton delivery truck that had no intention of stopping. Her name was Lena. She was 17 years old, and for the last 127 days, her entire world had been a 3-block radius surrounding the corner of 4th and Elm. She was an expert in the art of being invisible, a ghost haunting the periphery of other people's lives. She knew the precise moment the morning sun would hit the brick wall of Henderson's Hardware, offering a sliver of warmth. She knew the smell of the exhaust from the 8:14 a.m. city bus was different from the 8:22. She existed in a world of minute, ignored details until she didn't. The boy's name was Cody. He was 6, and his world was the bright red rubber ball that had just escaped his grasp. It bounced once, a perfect arc against the grimy asphalt, and then a second time, directly into the path of the oncoming truck. He did what any 6-year-old would do. He followed it. His father, a man whose physical presence was as large and loud as the Harley Davidson he rode, was 3 feet away. 3 feet. But in that moment, he was 1,000,000 miles away, his attention snagged for exactly 4 seconds by a text message vibrating in his pocket. A lifetime can be lost in 4 seconds. The man's name was Bear. That wasn't the name on his birth certificate, but it was the only one that mattered. It was welded to his identity by 2 decades of brotherhood, loyalty, and a life lived on 2 wheels. The roar that filled his ears wasn't the familiar thunder of his engine. It was the primal, blood-freezing screech of his own heart seizing in his chest. He saw it all in a horrifying, slow-motion tableau. The red ball, a punctuation mark of doom. Cody's small frame, a blur of a blue jacket. The massive, indifferent grille of the Isuzu box truck, bearing down like a judgment. And then, another blur. A flash of gray hoodie moving from a dead stop with an impossible, desperate velocity. Lena wasn't thinking. There was no time for thought. For 127 days, her body had been a burden to be fed, kept warm, and hidden. Now, it was a tool, an instrument of pure, unthinking instinct. The same instinct that makes a mother lift a car, that makes a soldier fall on a grenade. It was the instinct of protection. She didn't know the boy. She had seen him a few times, clinging to the hand of the giant, leather-clad man. She had sketched his laughing face once in the battered notebook she kept tucked in her backpack, a brief moment of light in her gray world. Her shoulder hit Cody's small body with the force of a linebacker. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a violent, life-saving shove that sent him tumbling backward, out of the path of destruction and onto the relative safety of the cracked sidewalk. He landed in a heap, scraped and crying, but whole. Lena was not so lucky. Her momentum carried her forward into the space he had just occupied. She had just enough time to twist, to try and turn her body away, a final, futile act of self-preservation. The impact wasn't loud. It was a sickening thud, a sound of metal meeting flesh and bone that was absorbed by the larger cacophony of the truck's screeching brakes. The truck, a 2018 Isuzu FTR, weighing approximately 19,500 pounds empty, came to a halt 17 feet past the point of impact. For a single, horrifying second, the world fell silent. The traffic stopped. The pedestrians froze. The city held its breath. Then, the sound rushed back in. A woman screamed. Car horns, delayed and angry, began to blare. And a little boy cried for his father. Bear was already moving, his massive frame covering the ground in 2 strides. He scooped Cody into his arms, crushing the boy to his chest, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His son was alive. He was crying. He was real. He buried his face in Cody's hair, inhaling the scent of shampoo and playground dirt, a scent he had almost lost forever. His gaze then shifted to the street. Lena lay in a crumpled heap. The gray hoodie was rucked up, revealing a painfully thin back. One leg was bent at an angle that was fundamentally wrong. The scuffed sneaker had been thrown from her foot and lay on its side, a lonely sentinel 20 feet away. She was utterly still. The truck driver, a man named Arthur Finch, 58 years old, a driver for a regional office supply company for 22 years, climbed out of his cab. He was shaking. A dark stain spread across the front of his light blue uniform shirt where his coffee had spilled. He looked at the girl on the ground, then at his truck, then back at the girl, his face a mask of bewildered horror. "I didn't see her," he said to no one in particular. "She came out of nowhere." Bear didn't hear him. He was on his knees now, Cody still clutched in one arm, his other hand hovering over the girl's still form, afraid to touch her, afraid of the damage he might find. He saw the wisp of her breath fogging in the cool November air, a tiny, fragile cloud of life. In that moment, a promise was forged in the crucible of his terror and gratitude, a promise made not with words, but with the entire force of his being. He looked from the broken girl to his sobbing son and back again. She saved him. The thought was a bell tolling in his soul. She saved him. We save her. It was not a prayer. It was a vow, a sacred oath declared in the middle of a city street, witnessed by the gathering crowd and the cold, indifferent sky. Mr. Alistair Henderson, proprietor of Henderson's Hardware for 34 years, was the one who called 911. He had been standing at his front window, watching the afternoon traffic, a ritual as ingrained as his morning coffee. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen it not as a chaotic accident, but as the terrible logical conclusion to a story he had been watching unfold for months. He had seen the girl arrive in late summer, a wraith with haunted eyes and a backpack that never left her side. He knew her name wasn't Jane Doe, as the paramedics would soon label her. He didn't know her name at all, but he knew her. He knew she slept in the recessed doorway of the old bookstore 2 doors down. He knew she spent her mornings in the public library, not for the warmth, but for the books. He had seen her once, through the library window, hunched over a thick volume of anatomy, sketching the human hand with an intensity that was almost painful to watch. He knew she ate once a day, usually a bagel she bought from the bakery with crumpled dollars she earned from collecting cans. He knew she never begged. He knew she flinched if anyone got too close, that her body was coiled tight with a fear that had been programmed into her muscles. He saw the trauma in the way she held herself, in the constant, scanning motion of her eyes. He had considered calling social services a dozen times, but he had also seen the cynicism in the eyes of the city officials who occasionally swept through the neighborhood. He feared, perhaps correctly, that the system he would deliver her to would be colder and more dangerous than the street she had chosen. So he had done nothing but watch, and now the guilt of his inaction was a physical weight in his chest. The wail of the siren grew closer, a sound that sliced through the afternoon haze. The ambulance, Unit 73, arrived in under 6 minutes. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, moved with practiced efficiency. Their faces were professional masks, betraying none of the emotion that gripped the onlookers. To them, Lena was another call, another piece of street debris to be scraped up and delivered to the ER. They saw the worn clothes, the thin frame, the grime under her fingernails. The word transient was already forming in their minds, the first entry in a report that would reduce her life to a series of checkboxes. As they worked, cutting away the gray hoodie to access her injuries, her backpack fell to the pavement. It was old, the zippers strained, but it was the one thing Mr. Henderson had ever seen her protect, with a fierce, silent jealousy. It fell open, spilling its meager contents, a half-eaten bag of pretzels, a water bottle, and a small spiral-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth with use. One of the paramedics kicked it aside with his boot, his focus on the IV line he was trying to insert into her arm. At that moment, a new sound began to permeate the air, a low rumble that grew steadily into a ground-shaking thunder. It was the sound of V-twin engines, not one or two, but a dozen, then more. They came from the east, a wave of chrome and black leather cresting the hill on 4th Street. The first members of the Lost Saints Motorcycle Club, the local Hells Angels charter, were arriving. Bear had made one call, his voice choked and raw, to his chapter president. The word had spread through their network like wildfire. They didn't park haphazardly. They formed a semicircle, their bikes creating a wall, a barrier between the scene and the gawking public. They dismounted without a word, their faces grim, their eyes hard. They were an intimidating presence, a tribe of giants descending upon a scene of chaos. They didn't interfere with the paramedics, but they watched their every move with an unnerving focus. They were creating a space, claiming it as their own. The police who had arrived kept a respectful distance. They knew these men. They knew that today, they were not the problem. The chapter president, a man known only as Preacher for his quiet, measured way of speaking and the silver cross he wore amidst the patches on his cut, walked to Bear. He placed a heavy hand on his friend's shoulder. Bear didn't look up, his eyes still fixed on Lena. The paramedics were loading her onto a backboard, strapping her down. "She saved him, Preacher," Bear whispered, his voice cracking. "She saved my boy." Preacher's eyes, which had seen more than their share of violence and tragedy, softened. He looked at the small, broken form on the gurney. He saw not a transient, not a Jane Doe. He saw the instrument of a miracle. He saw a debt. "Then I reckon we owe her," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We owe her everything." As the ambulance doors closed, sealing Lena inside, Mr. Henderson, the watcher, did something he hadn't done in years. He stepped out from behind the safety of his storefront window. He walked through the crowd, past the wall of bikers, and picked up the battered notebook from the gutter. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the secrets it held. He walked over to the towering man they called Preacher, a man he had only ever seen from a distance, a man who frankly terrified him. "I think this is hers," Mr. Henderson said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I think it might be important." Preacher looked down at the small shopkeeper, then at the notebook. He took it with a surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers dwarfing the small object. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, silent acknowledgement. The ambulance pulled away, its siren now a receding scream. The bikers remained, a silent, unmovable vigil on a street corner that had just become sacred ground. The oath had been declared. Now it would be honored. St. Mary's General Hospital was a monument to beige indifference. The walls were beige, the floors were beige, the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting room were a slightly different, more depressing shade of beige. It smelled of antiseptic, floor wax, and quiet desperation. It was a place designed to process human suffering with maximum efficiency and minimum emotional engagement. For the staff at the admissions desk, Lena was a problem that arrived on a gurney at 4:43 p.m. The admitting nurse, a woman named Carol with 20 years of service etched into the lines around her mouth, began the litany. Name. The paramedic shrugged. Jane Doe. Date of birth. Unknown. Insurance. He gave her a look that said it all. Carol sighed and typed uninsured/self-pay into the system, a designation that immediately shunted Lena into a different, less urgent category of care. A hospital social worker was paged. Her name was Ms. Albright, and she had the weary, perpetually disappointed eyes of someone who had spent 15 years navigating the labyrinth of a broken system. She pulled up the file. Jane Doe, approximately 17 to 19 years old, transient, no next of kin. Her mind immediately began churning through the flowchart of institutional procedure. If the girl survived, she would need placement. A shelter, probably. A group home. The same system of overworked case managers and underfunded facilities that had likely failed her a dozen times before. Ms. Albright made a note in the file, her duty technically fulfilled, and moved on to the next case. The system was doing what it was designed to do: process, categorize, and contain. But something was happening in the waiting room that was not part of the hospital's standard operating procedure. The lost saints were arriving. They came not in a thunderous roar, but in small, quiet groups. They didn't swagger or shout. They simply entered, found a space, and occupied it. First there were 10, then 20, then 50. They filled the beige room with the scent of leather, road dust, and an unspoken intensity that made the air thick. They were too big for the chairs. Their patched vests, adorned with the winged death's head of the Hell's Angels, were a stark, visceral contrast to the sterile environment. They were a tribe, a clan, an occupying army of guardians, and they were not leaving. Nurses whispered as they passed. Security guards watched from a distance, their hands hovering near their radios, but they made no move to intervene. The bikers were a paradox, a terrifying presence that was, for the moment, utterly peaceful. One of them, a man with a gray beard braided into 2 thick ropes, went on a coffee run and returned with 4 cardboard trays, handing out cups to his brothers in silence. They were settling in for a long siege. Bear was not in the waiting room. He was in a small examination cubicle in the pediatric wing with Cody, a young doctor was checking his son over, shining a light in his eyes, testing his reflexes. Physically, Cody was fine. A few scrapes on his hands, a bruise forming on his hip. But the real injury was invisible. He was quiet, his small body trembling, his face buried in his father's side. He wouldn't let go. Bear held him, the solid, warm weight of his son a grounding anchor in a sea of guilt. 4 seconds. He had looked at his phone for 4 seconds. A message from another member about a weekend ride. Trivial, meaningless. And in those 4 seconds, the universe had nearly ripped his world apart. The guilt was a physical thing, a shard of glass in his gut. He had failed in his most sacred duty, to protect his son. A stranger, a ghost of a girl he had never even truly seen, had done his job for him. He looked through the gap in the curtain toward the main hallway, his gaze fixed on the double doors that led to the surgical wing. He was tethered to that spot, to the unknown fate of the girl who had paid for his momentary lapse with her own body. An hour passed. Then 2. At 7:12 p.m., a surgeon in blue scrubs, his face drawn and tired, pushed through the double doors and entered the waiting room. The bikers, who had been sitting in stoic silence, rose as one. The sudden movement of 50 large men getting to their feet was unnerving, but the surgeon held his ground. "I'm looking for the family of Jane Doe," he began, his voice flat. Bear appeared at his side as if from nowhere. "That's us," he said, his voice raspy. "We're her family." The surgeon looked at the giant, leather-clad man, then at the silent army behind him, and wisely chose not to argue the point. He led Bear and Preacher into a small private consultation room. The news was not good. He spoke in the detached language of medicine. Multiple comminuted fractures to the left tibia and fibula, 3 fractured ribs, a ruptured spleen, which we've removed. Significant internal bleeding, now controlled. He paused, taking a breath before delivering the worst of it. "The main concern is the head injury. She has a severe concussion and significant swelling of the brain, a subdural hematoma. We've drilled a burr hole to relieve the pressure, but she's in a coma. Right now, she's in critical condition. The next 48 hours are crucial." He used phrases like guarded prognosis and wait and see. He was trying to manage their expectations, to prepare them for the worst. "What are her chances, Doc?" Bear asked, the question blunt and stripped of all pleasantry. The surgeon hesitated. "Honestly, they're not good, given the force of the impact. She's lucky to be alive at all, but the road ahead is uncertain." Bear and Preacher listened, their faces carved from stone. They didn't flinch. They didn't show fear. They just absorbed the information. When the doctor left, they stood in the small, silent room for a long moment. The dread was a palpable thing, a cold weight in the air. Bear leaned against the wall, the sheer force of his will the only thing holding him upright. "Uncertain," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Preacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "The doctor said she's lucky to be alive," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't believe in luck. She's a fighter. So we fight." They walked back out to the waiting room. Every eye was on them. Preacher didn't need to make a speech. He just looked at his brothers, his gaze sweeping across the room. The message was clear. The vigil was no longer just about waiting. It was about standing guard. It was about refusing to let her go. They were the wall, and they would not let the darkness have her. Preacher sat in a hard plastic chair under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room, the small, spiral-bound notebook in his hands. It felt fragile, almost insignificant in his grasp. He had held it for hours, a talisman connecting him to the unconscious girl in the ICU. Finally, under the silent gaze of his brothers, he opened it. It was not a diary. There were no teenage confessions, no tales of heartbreak or despair. The pages were filled with drawings, sketches, rendered in painstaking detail with a simple ballpoint pen. There were architectural drawings of the buildings on 4th and Elm, the cornices and brickwork captured with an architect's eye. There were studies of hands, the gnarled hands of a homeless man who sometimes slept on a nearby bench, the smooth hands of a mother pushing a stroller, his own hands, he realized with a jolt, resting on the handlebars of his bike. Lena had been watching them all, documenting their world with a silent, observant precision. But mostly there were faces, the faces of strangers caught in moments of laughter, worry, or contemplation, and one face, over and over again. A young boy, no older than 9 or 10. His hair was a wild mop, his eyes wide and serious. In some sketches, he was smiling a gappy-toothed grin. In others, he looked lost and frightened. Beneath one particularly detailed portrait, a name was written, practiced in a dozen different scripts, as if the very act of writing it was a prayer. Elias. The bikers passed the notebook from hand to hand, a silent, reverent communion. These drawings were more than just art. They were a testament. They were proof of a life, a soul, a person who saw the world with a clarity that none of them possessed. The boy, Elias, was the key. He was not just a memory. He was a mission. Who is she? The question hung in the air. And where is this boy? The Lost Saints, a group of men more accustomed to rebuilding carburetors and settling disputes with their fists, were about to become a team of private investigators. The mission had expanded. It was no longer just a vigil for Lena's survival. It was a quest for her identity, a hunt for her past. The man they called Hacker, a quiet member who ran a successful IT security firm in his civilian life, pulled out a laptop. He was a wizard, a ghost in the machine who could navigate the labyrinth of the digital world. He started with nothing. Jane Doe. No fingerprints on file, no dental records. She was a ghost in the system. As Hacker began his digital search, Lena's mind, adrift in the gray fog of her coma, was also searching. Her memories were fragmented, disjointed images floating in the darkness. A cramped apartment that smelled of stale beer and regret. The slamming of a door. A man's angry voice, a voice that belonged to their fourth foster father in 3 years. The sharp, stinging bite of a leather belt against her back. She remembered shielding her younger brother, Elias, with her own body. He was so small, so fragile. She remembered the social worker with the tired eyes, the same eyes as Ms. Albright, who had come to take Elias away. They said he needed special attention. They said she was a bad influence. She remembered her last promise to him, whispered through the closed door of a bedroom. "I will find you, Eli, I promise. Don't worry, I will find you." That promise had become her compass, her reason for being. She had aged out of the system a year later, spat out with a bus ticket and $200. She hadn't spent it on an apartment or a new life. She had used it to travel, following whispers and rumors, searching for the brother the state had swallowed whole. Her journey had ended here, on this street corner, because of a vague tip that a boy matching his description had been seen in this city. She had run away from the system to find the brother the system had taken. Hacker, meanwhile, was hitting wall after digital wall. Juvenile records were sealed tighter than a drum. The Child Protective Services database was a fortress. The state, in its supposed effort to protect the privacy of the children it was responsible for, had effectively made them disappear. It was the ultimate institutional failure. A system designed to protect children had become a black hole, erasing them from the world. But the bikers had another network, an older one, built on favors, handshakes, and shared histories. They knew people. They knew the underbelly of the city, the people who operated in the gray spaces the system ignored. A member named Tiny, a man who owned a tow truck company and knew every cop and city worker in a 50-mile radius, started making calls. Their first breakthrough came from a disgruntled former clerk at the County Family Services Department. For a case of beer and the promise of a free tune-up, she gave them a name, Davies, Mr. and Mrs. Davies, a foster family with a sterling record. They had fostered Lena and Elias 4 years ago. The clerk remembered them. The girl was difficult. The boy was troubled. 2 of the club's senior members, men known for their calm demeanor and intimidating size, paid a visit to Mr. Davies. They found him in a pristine suburban cul-de-sac, mowing his perfectly manicured lawn. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft handshake and a practiced, neighborly smile. The mundanity of his evil was chilling. He invited them inside, offered them iced tea. He spoke of Lena with a tone of paternal disappointment. "A troubled girl," he said, shaking his head. "Always lying, always causing problems. We did our best, but you can't save them all." "And the boy? Elias?" Davies's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A sweet boy, but very disturbed. He had to be moved to a more specialized facility for his own good. I'm afraid I don't know where he ended up. The system handles all that." His denial was smooth, seamless, the product of years of practice. He was a pillar of his community, a church elder. Who would believe a pair of bikers over him? The bikers thanked him for his time and left, but they knew he was lying. They could smell it, a foul odor beneath the scent of fresh-cut grass and air freshener. They had his name, they had his address, and they had a notebook full of drawings of a frightened little boy. The hunt had just begun. The confrontation, when it came, was not violent. It was something far more unnerving. It was quiet. Bear and Preacher returned to the suburban cul-de-sac the next evening. They didn't knock. They had seen Mr. Davies leave with his wife for their weekly church group meeting. A member of the club, who was a locksmith by trade, had opened the front door in under 30 seconds. They let themselves in. They didn't ransack the place. They just sat. They sat on the floral-patterned sofa in the meticulously clean living room, 2 mountains of leather and denim in a sea of beige carpet and polished wood. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. When Mr. Davies walked in at 9:15 p.m., humming a hymn, he froze in the doorway, his face draining of all color. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. "Sit down, Mr. Davies," Preacher said. His voice was not a command. It was a calm, reasonable invitation, which made it all the more terrifying. Davies, trembling, sank into an armchair opposite them. He looked from Preacher's calm, watchful face to Bear's, which was a mask of tightly controlled rage. Preacher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was genuine. "We're here to talk about promises. A promise is a sacred thing. It's a weight. Some people, they make them and forget them. But some promises, they have to be kept, no matter what." Bear spoke next, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "My son is 6 years old. When that truck was coming, I saw his face, the look in his eyes. It's a look a father should never have to see. And a girl I didn't even know, a girl you called troubled, she took that look away. She put herself in front of that truck. For my son, for a stranger." Bear's gaze was unwavering, and in it, Davies saw a reflection of a primal protective fury he could not comprehend. "She made a promise too," Preacher continued, his voice soft again. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out the notebook. He didn't throw it. He placed it gently on the polished mahogany coffee table between them. It was open to a page filled with sketches of Elias. In the center was a portrait, the boy's eyes wide with a fear that was so palpable it felt like an accusation. Davies stared at the drawing, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his smooth, practiced facade. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "We know you hurt her," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And we know you're lying about the boy. All we want is a name, a location. We just want to help her keep her promise." The dam of Davies's deception finally broke. It wasn't a noble confession. It was a pathetic, whining torrent of excuses. He lost his temper. The boy was defiant. He wet the bed. It was an accident. The system took him. They moved him. I don't know where. Bear stood up, the sudden movement causing Davies to flinch violently. Where? The single word was an explosion in the quiet room. Pinewood. The name flew from Davies's lips, a desperate plea. Pinewood Residential Center. Up north, near the state line. That's all I know, I swear. Preacher and Bear looked at each other. They had what they came for. They stood up and walked to the door, leaving the notebook on the table. They didn't say another word. They didn't need to. The silence and the drawing of the terrified boy they left behind were a judgment far heavier than any threat. Back at St. Mary's, a different kind of breakthrough was happening. At 10:03 p.m., a nurse was checking Lena's vitals. As she adjusted the blanket, she felt a faint pressure on her hand. She looked down. Lena's fingers, thin and pale, had tightened around hers. It was a flicker, a barely perceptible spasm, but it was a voluntary muscle movement. The nurse's eyes widened. She called for the doctor. The news spread through the waiting room like a current of electricity. She squeezed a hand. The words were whispered from biker to biker. A small thing, a tiny flicker of life in the overwhelming darkness. But it was hope. The grim, stoic vigil transformed in that instant. It was no longer a death watch. It was a cheerleading section. The energy in the room shifted from passive waiting to active, collective will. They were pulling for her, pouring all their hope and energy through the walls and down the hallway into that ICU room. When Bear and Preacher returned, the news met them at the door. Bear's stony expression cracked, the relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He went straight to the ICU, standing outside the glass, looking at her still form, now seeing not just a victim, but a fighter. The mission was now clear, concrete, and twofold. Save Lena. Find Elias. Preacher gathered the senior members of the club. The operation became a matter of logistics. They were a disciplined, organized unit, and they now had a singular purpose. A core group would remain at the hospital, maintaining the 24/7 vigil and shifts. Another group, led by the club's treasurer, would organize a fundraiser, a poker run for the following weekend, to cover the astronomical medical bills that were already accumulating, and a third team, the search and rescue team, would be dispatched at dawn. Their destination, Pinewood Residential Center, 300 miles north. The oath was becoming action. The promise was becoming a plan. The sound began just before dawn, a symphony of engines firing to life in the pre-light gloom. 30 motorcycles, polished and prepared, stood waiting in the hospital parking lot. They were not the full contingent of 184 members from the associated charters, but they were the tip of the spear. This was the ride for Elias. The journey north was a display of controlled power. They moved as a single entity, a river of steel and leather flowing up the interstate. They took up an entire lane, a rolling fortress that other vehicles instinctively gave a wide berth. For the men on the bikes, the ride was a ritual, a meditation. The wind, the vibration of the engine, the unwavering focus required to ride in tight formation, it cleared the mind, honing their collective will into a sharp point. Bear led the pack, his face set, the miles peeling away under his wheels. Each mile was a mile closer to keeping a promise he had made to a girl he barely knew, a promise that now felt like the most important one of his life. They arrived at the Pinewood Residential Center just after noon. The name was a cruel irony. There were no pines, only a collection of drab single-story concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It wasn't a home. It was a holding pen. It had the bleak, hopeless air of a place forgotten by the world, another underfunded, overlooked cog in the state's failing machinery of care. The director, A man named Peterson with a cheap tie and the exhausted air of a career bureaucrat met them in the parking lot. He was clearly intimidated by the sudden appearance of 30 Hell's Angels, but his adherence to protocol was stronger than his fear. "I can't help you," he said, standing his ground behind a clipboard shield. "We have strict privacy policies. I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of any specific minor at this facility. It's the law." He stonewalled them with practiced ease, quoting regulations and statutes. He was a human wall of red tape. The bikers stood, their engines ticking as they cooled, their frustration a palpable, simmering heat. They had come so far, only to be stopped by a rule book. But just as in the city, there are always the overlooked observers, the ones who see what the system is designed to ignore. A janitor, an older man named George, was sweeping the entryway, seemingly oblivious to the standoff. He was 67 years old and had worked at Pinewood for 20 of them. He had seen hundreds of kids pass through these doors, their faces a blur of fear and loneliness. He had seen the hope drain from their eyes. He had seen the system fail again and again. Bear, sensing the impasse with the director, walked away from the group. He saw George and approached him, not with intimidation, but with a quiet desperation. He didn't speak. He simply took out the notebook. He had brought it with him, and opened it to the clearest drawing of Elias. He just held it out. "We're looking for this boy. His sister she's in the hospital. She's asking for him." George looked from the drawing to the giant biker's face. He saw past the leather and the patches. He saw the raw, pleading honesty in Bear's eyes. He recognized the boy in the drawing. He knew him. He saw him every day in the cafeteria, a small, quiet kid who always sat alone, and he had heard the staff talking. The boy was scheduled for transfer, another move to another facility even further away. He was set to leave in 2 days. He was about to be lost again, swallowed by the next level of bureaucracy. George glanced over his shoulder at the director, who was still pontificating to Preacher. He leaned in close to Bear, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "His name is Elias Winters. He's here, but they're moving him Friday morning. You've got less than 48 hours." The information was a lifeline, a deadline. The countdown had begun. The bikers regrouped at a dusty diner 5 miles down the road. The mission had changed again. This was no longer a search. It was a legal battle against a ticking clock. Hacker was on his laptop, his fingers flying. The club treasurer was on the phone, moving funds. They needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. They needed a shark. They found her through a member whose cousin was a court clerk. Her name was Sharon Pierce, a solo practitioner with a reputation as a ferocious advocate for children's rights, a woman who ate bureaucrats like Peterson for breakfast. When Preacher called her, she was skeptical. The Hell's Angels. But as he laid out the story, the accident, the girl, the promise, the abusive foster father, the brother hidden in a state facility, her skepticism turned to outrage, and then to a cold, professional fury. "Send me everything you have," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. The notebook sketches, a statement from the shopkeeper, the address of Mr. Davies, the name of the janitor. Everything. And get your money ready. This is going to be a fight. The Lost Saints didn't hesitate. Within an hour, they had wired her a retainer that made her eyebrows shoot up. They were all in, the full weight of the club, their resources, their network, their unwavering collective will, was now focused on a single point, a custody hearing in a small county courthouse, 300 miles from home. The clock was ticking. Lena surfaced from the gray fog slowly, as if rising from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The first thing she registered was sound, the rhythmic, gentle beep of a machine somewhere to her right. The second was a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to encompass her entire body. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, glued shut. She was adrift, a consciousness disconnected from its vessel. Then a name floated up from the depths, a name that was her anchor, her compass, her entire reason for being. She forced her lips to move, her throat raw and dry. The sound that emerged was barely a whisper, a dry rasp of air. Elias. The room, which had been filled with the low murmur of conversation and the beeping of the monitor, fell silent. Bear, who had been sitting in a chair by her bed for 12 straight hours, shot to his feet. He leaned over her, his large, rough hand gently taking hers. "Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we're here. You're safe." She tried again, a little stronger this time, the single word a desperate plea. "Elias." Bear's heart clenched. He looked at Preacher, who stood in the doorway, and saw his own emotion reflected in his friend's eyes. This was the moment, the pivot point. He leaned closer, his voice a low, steady promise. "We know, Lena. We know about Elias. We're getting him." He squeezed her hand gently. "He's safe. We're bringing him to you. I promise. You will see your brother." It was a sacred oath, sworn at the bedside of a broken girl. And even in her semi-conscious state, she heard it. The tension that had held her body rigid, even in sleep, seemed to lessen. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She had been heard, her promise had been accepted, and now it was shared. 300 miles away, in a stuffy, wood-paneled courtroom, that oath was being put to the test. Sharon Pierce stood before a stern, weary-looking family court judge. The courtroom was packed, an unprecedented sight for a Tuesday morning custody hearing. The back benches were filled with silent, leather-clad men. The sheer number of them, over 50 bikers who had ridden up to support the cause, had created a palpable tension. The judge, a man named Henderson, a strange coincidence not lost on Preacher, was deeply skeptical. He looked from the phalanx of bikers to the petition in his hand, his expression one of profound disbelief. Emergency temporary guardianship of a minor, Elias Winters, requested by one Bear? But Sharon Pierce was a master of her craft. She didn't lead with emotion. She led with facts. She presented a binder 3 inches thick. Exhibit A, a sworn, notarized statement from Mr. Alistair Henderson of Henderson's Hardware, testifying to Lena's quiet character and her desperate solitary search. Exhibit B, high-resolution photographs of every page of Lena's notebook, the sketches of Elias, a haunting, silent testimony. Exhibit C, a full confession from Mr. Davies, obtained by a private investigator Sharon had hired, detailing the abuse and his deliberate concealment of Elias's location. Exhibit D, a sworn affidavit from George, the janitor at Pinewood, corroborating Elias's presence and the impending transfer. The state's attorney, an overworked young lawyer, looked flustered. He argued procedure, privacy, lack of standing. But Sharon Pierce dismantled his arguments one by one. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "the state has failed this boy. It has failed his sister. It placed them with an abuser. It separated them. And now it is about to lose one of them in the bureaucratic shuffle again. These men," she said, gesturing to the silent crowd behind her, "they are here to do the job the state has proven incapable of doing. They are here to honor a promise." The judge looked at Bear, who stood beside his lawyer. He saw not a fearsome biker, but a man radiating a fierce, protective gravity. He looked at the evidence. He looked at the silent, watchful men in his courtroom. he made a decision. Temporary guardianship is granted to Mr. Bear, pending a full investigation into the matter of Mr. Davies and a review of the minor's case file. You can pick up the boy. The drive back to Pinewood was a victory lap. When they arrived, the director, Peterson, met them with a crisp court order in his hand. His face was a mask of defeated resignation. He led Bear and Preacher down a long, sterile hallway to a small room. Elias Winters was sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, a small, worn suitcase at his feet. He was tiny, smaller than Bear had imagined, with the same wide, serious eyes as the drawings. When he saw the two huge, bearded men in the doorway, he flinched and drew back, his body language screaming fear and distrust. He had learned long ago that large men meant pain. Bear's heart broke. He didn't approach. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He didn't speak. He simply held out Lena's notebook, open to a drawing of the two of them as children, sitting on a park bench, holding hands. Elias's eyes fixed on the drawing. His breath hitched. He looked from the notebook to Bear's face, and for the first time the fear in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Recognition. Hope. Lena? He whispered, the name a fragile question. Bear nodded. She sent us. We're taking you to her. The ride back to the hospital was not a thunderous charge. It was a procession, an honor guard. Elias sat in the back of a borrowed SUV driven by Bear, sandwiched between two escort bikes. For the first hour he was silent, staring out the window at the incredible sight of his 30 motorcycle escort. Slowly, the fear began to melt away, replaced by a dawning sense of awe and wonder. No one had ever come for him before. They arrived at St. Mary's just after dark. The hospital corridors were lined with bikers, a silent honor guard parting to let them pass. Bear led Elias by the hand to the door of ICU room 3. He pushed the door open. Lena was awake, propped up on a mountain of pillows. She was pale, bruised, and impossibly fragile, an IV line snaking into her arm. But her eyes were open, and they were fixed on the door. Their gazes met across the room. For a count of 10 seconds, the world stopped. There was no beeping monitor, no hospital smell, no crowd of bikers in the hall. There was only a brother and a sister, two halves of a broken soul, seeing each other for the first time in 4 years, 3 months, and 12 days. Then a tear escaped Lena's eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. Elias. The name, spoken in a clear, soft voice, broke the spell. The boy ran. He scrambled onto the bed, ignoring the tubes and wires, and threw his arms around his sister's neck. The embrace was awkward, and it must have been painful for Lena. But it was everything. It was the fulfillment of a promise. It was the end of a long, desperate search. It was the impossible made real. In the hallway, the leather-clad giants of the Lost Saints turned away, one by one. They gave the children their moment, their backs to the door. More than one hardened man, a man with scars and a past, reached up a calloused hand to wipe away a tear. The debt was being paid. The reunion in the hospital room was not an ending. It was a beginning, the first difficult step in a long, arduous process of healing and building. Lena's body was a roadmap of trauma. Her recovery would be measured not in days or weeks, but in months and years. There were more surgeries to set the bones in her leg correctly. Endless sessions of physical therapy to learn to walk again, and the slow, invisible work of mending a mind fractured by the impact and a spirit bruised by years of neglect. The Lost Saints were there for every step. They became a strange, multifaceted, an utterly devoted support system. They were her chauffeurs, a rotating schedule of bikers driving her to and from physical therapy appointments in cars that looked comically small with them behind the wheel. They were her construction crew. A team of them descended on Bear's suburban house, and over one weekend they built a sturdy wheelchair ramp, widened doorways, and installed grab bars in the bathroom, making the space accessible for her. They were her chefs, showing up with casseroles and containers of soup, ensuring she and Elias, who was now living with Bear under his temporary guardianship, were fed. They were her bodyguards, her cheerleaders, her family. Lena began to change. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at first. The hunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started to speak more, her voice gaining strength. One afternoon, Bear found her sitting on the newly built ramp, the old notebook in her lap, sketching for the first time since the accident. But she wasn't drawing strangers anymore. She was drawing Cody, showing him how to hold a pencil. She was drawing Bear, capturing the unexpected gentleness in his eyes. She was sketching the intricate patches on Preacher's vest. The subjects of her art were no longer the anonymous backdrop of her life. They were the faces of her family. The club was changing too. The mission to save Lena and find Elias had awakened something within them. These were men who lived by a code of loyalty and brotherhood, but that code had always been directed inward, toward the club itself. Now it had an external purpose. They had seen, up close, how easily a child could be broken and discarded by the very systems designed to protect them. They had used their power, their intimidating presence, and their resources to push back. And they had won. It was a revelation. At a club meeting, Preacher stood before the assembled members. "We did a good thing," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "But this girl, this boy, they're not the only ones. There are others, hundreds of them, falling through the same cracks." That night, they made a decision. They formed a foundation. They called it, simply, Lena's Promise. Its mission was to provide emergency aid, legal support, and advocacy for children lost in the foster care system. They seeded it with the money left over from the poker run they had held for Lena's medical bills. A staggering $78,451 had been raised in a single afternoon. The Lost Saints, a group the world saw as outlaws, had become the fiercest and most unlikely of child advocates. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, began to be served. Arthur Finch, the truck driver, lost his commercial driver's license and his job. It was a small, almost insignificant consequence in the grand scheme of things, a man's livelihood lost for 4 seconds of inattention. The real justice was reserved for Mr. Davies. Armed with the confession and the full backing of the Lost Saints Legal Fund, the county prosecutor opened an investigation. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of having to testify in a courtroom full of bikers, Davies pleaded guilty. He was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment, his name stripped from the church rolls, his perfect suburban life dismantled. The system, when shoved with overwhelming force by an outside entity, had been made to work. A new normal began to establish itself in Bear's house. It was a chaotic, noisy, and beautiful normal. It was the sound of Elias and Cody arguing over a video game. It was the sight of Lena, now on crutches, patiently teaching a massive tattooed biker how to draw a horse. It was the smell of a dozen pizzas being delivered on a Friday night, the club's unofficial family dinner. 6 months after the accident, Bear, with Lena and Elias's joyful consent, officially adopted them both. The court hearing was a formality. The courtroom was once again filled with bikers, but this time they were not there to intimidate. They were there to witness the legal recognition of a family that had already been forged in fire, loyalty, and love. Lena, the girl who had been a ghost, now had a home. Elias, the boy who had been lost, now had a brother and a father. And Bear, the man who had nearly lost everything, had gained a family larger and more profound than he had ever imagined. 1 year, 365 days, a timestamp marking a full revolution around the sun since the moment that had changed everything. The anniversary was marked not with somber reflection, but with a celebration. The Lost Saints clubhouse, usually a place of loud music and rough camaraderie, was filled with the sounds of children's laughter. A massive barbecue was underway, smoke from the grill mingling with the scent of summer grass. Lena was there, standing near the grill, talking with Preacher. She walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the only visible scar from her ordeal. But she wasn't the same girl. The 93-pound wraith was gone, replaced by a healthy young woman with light in her eyes and a quick smile. She was 18 now, a legal adult, but she had no intention of leaving the chaotic, loving home she had found. Elias, now a confident 11-year-old, was in the middle of a frantic water gun fight with Cody and 3 other bikers' kids, his shrieks of laughter echoing across the yard. Preacher watched them for a moment, then went inside the clubhouse. He returned with a large, heavy, leather-bound book. It was the club's ledger, a sacred text that recorded the history of the charter, its debts and credits, its roster of brothers, living and dead. He opened it to a fresh page, the crisp paper, a stark contrast to the worn, ink-stained pages before it. He took out a pen. He wrote Lena's name in careful block letters, Lena Winters. Then, next to it, where a debt or a payment would normally be recorded, he wrote a single word, family. He underlined it twice. Then he looked at Bear, who was watching him, and said, paid in full. Later, as the sun began to set, the narrator inside the story, the witness historian, would take stock. The numbers were concrete, grounding the miracle in hard data. 184 bikers from 3 associated charters mobilized. $78,451 raised. 1 corrupt foster parent brought to justice. 2 children saved from a broken system. 1 foundation, Lena's Promise, established. In its first 6 months of operation, that foundation had already intervened in the cases of 17 other children, providing legal aid, emergency housing, and a voice for the voiceless. The ripple effects of one girl's selfless act were spreading outward, a wave of positive change. From his hardware store across the street, Mr. Alistair Henderson watched the party from a distance. He had been invited, but he preferred to remain the observer. Earlier in the day, he had seen Bear, Lena, Elias, and Cody walking down the street, heading for the ice cream shop. He saw Lena stop for a moment at the corner of 4th and Elm, the exact spot where she used to sit, the exact spot where her life had been shattered and reborn. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away in pain. She simply looked at the spot on the asphalt, a quiet, contemplative gaze. Then she reached out, took Bear's hand, and kept walking. Mr. Henderson smiled. He had been a witness to her invisibility, a witness to her despair, and now he was a witness to her redemption. The story was complete. He could finally forgive himself for not acting sooner, because he understood that the universe had its own, strange and terrible timing. The corner of 4th and Elm looks the same. The asphalt is still cracked, stained with oil and the grime of the city. If you stand there when the afternoon sun is low, you can almost hear the ghost of screeching tires, the echo of a woman's scream. But it is just an echo. The corner is no longer a place of trauma. It is a place of genesis, the point of impact where a new world was created. You see them, don't you? In every city, on every street. The invisible ones, the overlooked, the ghosts who haunt the periphery of your busy life. The girl huddled in a doorway, the boy with eyes too old for his face. They are there. We train ourselves not to see them, because to see them is to acknowledge them, and to acknowledge them is to accept a responsibility we fear we cannot bear. What does it take to break that training? What does it take to truly see? A child's cry, a red ball rolling into the street, a sudden, shocking act of impossible courage? This story, in the end, is not about a homeless girl in a motorcycle club. It is about the fundamental, unspoken promise of human connection, the promise to see, the promise to act, the promise to protect. It is a story about the family we find, the family that finds us, forged not in the sterile bonds of blood, but in the white-hot crucible of a shared moment of crisis and grace. It's about the staggering, world-altering power of a small act, the decision to move when everyone else is frozen. The final scene is not at the clubhouse or on a street corner. It is a year and a half later, in a small, brightly lit art gallery downtown. The air is buzzing with conversation and the clinking of glasses. The walls are covered with charcoal drawings, sketches of breathtaking detail and emotional depth. It is Lena's first solo art show. The crowd is an eclectic mix. Art critics and professors stand shoulder to shoulder with men in leather vests bearing the insignia of the Hells Angels. Mr. Henderson is there, talking quietly with Sharon Pierce, the lawyer. Miss Albright, the social worker from the hospital, is also there, looking at the drawings with a stunned, contemplative expression. Lena stands in the center of the room. She is poised, confident, radiant. She is no longer defined by her limp or her past. She is defined by the work on the walls, by the vision she is sharing with the world. Bear, Cody, and Elias stand beside her, her anchor and her pride. The centerpiece of the show, hanging on the far wall, is a massive charcoal drawing, 10 feet wide. It is a stunningly detailed, panoramic view of the St. Mary's Hospital parking lot at night. In the center, under the harsh glow of the security lights, are 184 motorcycles, parked in a silent, perfect, protective circle. The drawing is rendered with such love and precision that you can almost feel the cool night air, hear the hum of the hospital generators, and sense the immense, patient power of the collective vigil. The title on the small plaque beside it is simple. It says, "The Vigil." Look around you. This is the final, unspoken message of the art on the walls, of the story that has been told. See the person no one else sees. Acknowledge the debt we all owe to each other. A single act of courage, a promise kept against all odds, can not only save a life, it can build a family, it can redeem a community, it can change the world. The story ends, but the possibility, the challenge, hangs in the air, as real and as heavy as a sacred oath.